Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Monsters Manifested, right here on DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode, we're going to be covering the Hezro. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. The Hezro's lore can be found on page 53, along with some other lesser demons lore, and its stat block can be found on page 60. But before we get into all of that, let's begin with the story of the Hezro. Hezro serve as foot soldiers in the demonic hordes of the abyss. Although physically powerful, they are weak-minded, and Hezris can easily be duped into sacrificing themselves by more powerful demons. As they press their attacks into the heart of an enemy's forces, their foul stench can sicken even the toughest foes. And that's all there is when it comes to the lore of the Hezro. Pretty short and sweet, concise. So it would appear to me, just from first impressions, that the Hezro is more so that of a form of demonic fodder, if you would, and just sort of exists to cause chaos and destruction and destroy everything it can, as well as it can, until it itself is destroyed. So, but without further ado, let's move into the stats of the Hezro. The Hezro is a large fiend, demon, with a chaotic evil alignment. It has an armor class of 16, which is natural armor. It has hit points that average 136, or 13d10 plus 65, and it has a movement speed of 30 feet. The Hezro has a strength of 19, a dexterity of 17, a constitution of 20, an intelligence of 5, a wisdom of 12, and a charisma of 13. Its saving throws include strength plus 7, constitution plus 8, and wisdom plus 4. Its damage resistances include cold, fire, lightning, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons. The Hezro has damage immunities to poison and condition immunities to the poisoned condition. It has senses of dark vision for 120 feet and a passive perception of 11. The Hezro can speak the languages of abyssal and telepathy at 120 feet, and it is a challenge rating of 8. On to the abilities. Magic resistance. The Hezro has advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. And stench. Any creature that starts its turn within 10 feet of the Hezro must succeed on a DC 14 Constitution saving throw or be poisoned until the start of its next turn. On a successful saving throw, the creature is immune to the Hezro's stench for 24 hours. On to the actions. Multi-attack. The Hezro makes 3 attacks, 1 with its bite and 2 with its claws. Bite is a melee weapon attack with a plus 7 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target, and on a hit, it does an average of 15 or 2d10 plus 4 piercing damage. And finally, Claw is a melee weapon attack with a plus 7 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target, and on a hit, it does an average of 11 or 2d6 plus 4 slashing damage. And that's all there is when it comes to the stats for the Hezro. Much like the lore, there's not too much here. It's fairly straightforward, fairly short and sweet, but I think that there's still enough here that we can use to make the Hezro an appealing monsters for our players to go up against. So, without further ado, let's jump into some adventure crafting, shall we? Okay, so first thing that comes to mind when looking at the Hezro and thinking of ways that we could implement it as a monster for an adventure, I immediately think of monster in the marsh causing havoc and chaos and instilling fear in the people of the area. So what you could do is you could create a scenario or an adventure where your players are in this town or city or castle, kingdom, anything like that. And maybe it's even the starting area for your players, right? And you can use the Hezro as sort of the first big bad, seeing as how the challenge rating of the creature is 8. So If you wanted to keep your campaign, or at least the first leg of your campaign, sort of localized to a smaller region, you could have the Hezro set as the first big boss or big baddie that your players have to go up against. You could even use it as a myth or legend or rumor type thing, the haunted swamp, stuff like that, the accursed marsh, or, the hazardous lagoon, what have you. And your players effectively have to make their way through this swampy, marsh-like environment where it's full of difficult terrain and perhaps oversized insects, where you can use maybe other types of demons, insectoid demons like the Chasme or anything like that, and lead them up to the Hezro as the final monster for them to take on and save the day, as it were. Another way that you could use the Hezro and implement it in an effective way, I think, is by using the Hezro as a type of monster that was summoned by otherwise lesser creatures, right? So consider perhaps a band of cultists, or perhaps some evil magic user, sorcerer of some sort, that is seeking to summon demons to do their bidding for them, right? In regards to the cultists, they would be summoning this demon to the material plane from the abyss, perhaps because they worship it and they would therefore like to reincarnate or resummon it into the material plane so that they may provide it with gifts or sacrifices or tribute of some form. And you could have a scenario where your players have to go through perhaps a cultist hideout or an abandoned crypt, or perhaps just some sort of strange organization even within a town or many towns, this kind of occult network of individuals that are all working to a common goal in this ritual of summoning the Hezro. And perhaps you can have your players make their way to the focal point or the meeting point, the central location where they're going to summon this Hezro, and maybe they stumble upon it right in the middle of the summoning ceremony or the ritual as it's taking place. And you can have the players interrupt this ritual successfully and manage to stop the cultists from summoning the Hezro. Or perhaps you could have them show up and they're there just to witness the final moments of the ceremony taking place, and the Hezro is summoned, and perhaps the Hezro takes them on directly. Perhaps the Hezro destroys and consumes or otherwise demolishes all of the patrons of the ritual and perhaps the location itself, and runs off and jumps away, disappears into the night, what have you. Or you could have it where the players are noticed by the Hezro or are spotted by the cultists, and a battle ensues where the cultists and the Hezro are going up against the players. And I think that you can make something pretty interesting for combat in that way, because the Hezro is effectively not very smart, but super tough and doesn't really care to do anything other than destroy and cause havoc. So you could have this sort of creature in a combat scenario, or that can paint a nice picture for your players where they see this sort of bull wrecking ball type thing running through to get to them, trying to destroy them and stuff like that, regardless of whoever is in the monster's way, right? Maybe it's picking up and throwing the cultists around or throwing them at the players to try to incapacitate them or cause some sort of damage to them. So I think that that could be one of many effective ways that a Hezro could be implemented in an adventure, just sort of as a quick drop in play and give a challenge for your players to go up against. Right now, if you want to make a deadly adventure, you could have them face the Hezro to the end and see who survives, which may be difficult, especially if they're underleveled due to the abilities and resistances of the Hezro. Or if you wanted to give them sort of a taste of the first big bad that they're going to have to go up against, you could have the Hezro show up and cause some damage and then come to the conclusion that these weaklings aren't worth its time, so it just disregards them and runs off, right? You could also, using that cultist ritual type situation, you could also make it so that the Hezro is present in the material plane, but the ritual is not necessarily completed yet. So as the players are going up against it and some of the cultists, maybe there's a small band of cultists, 2, 3, 4 of them that are maintaining the ritual because it has to go on for X amount of time in order for it to be permanent, for the spell to take effect, right? So maybe the goal is not actually fighting the Hezro and destroying it, but taking out the cultists that are keeping the ritual going, maintaining their spell casting, keeping the Hezro on the material plane for the time being. And if they can stop those cultists from continuing and finalizing this spell, the Hezro will disappear and be sent back to the abyss. Another way that you could use Hezros in an adventure that's not so dark and occult and macabre, if you would, is to use the Hezro as sort of a summoned monster, right? Sort of in the form of, let's say, a gladiatorial monster, or perhaps something like a criminal boss's disposal system, right? Any of you that are familiar with Star Wars can refer to Jabba the Hutt with the Rancor underneath the cantina that Luke has to fight and stuff when he gets dropped through the grate. Imagine something to that effect. And you could simply place the Hezro there as the monster that the players need to deal with because maybe they got trapped in this sort of web of criminality, or perhaps they were investigating this criminal underbelly and people got wise to their actions, or maybe these thieves or this guild, if you would, got sick of the players throwing a wrench into their plans every single time. So now they have essentially kidnapped the players and dropped them into this pit where they have to go up against the Hezro. You could even present it as like a couple of ne'er-do-wells approach the party and tell the party, like, listen, we've been going back and forth way too long and our boss is sick of it. They want to talk to you, see if we can parlay and sort of negotiate some sort of situation where there's an uneasy alliance. And when the players agree to it, as presumably they would, and they go to interact with the mob boss, there's a bit of back and forth. The mob boss says something to the effect of, well, this is how it ends. You thought you were coming here to parlay, and we are, but we're really just discussing how you want to die because you're never making it out of this place alive. And boom, they're dropped into the fighting pit or dropped into this area where they have to take on this stinking creature, right? And simple as that, you have a Hezro as the big bad for this adventure, and your players will have a pretty serious challenge on their hands. And this can work pretty effectively, especially if you've already sort of built up to it in previous adventures that involve this kind of seedy criminal underbelly that your players are trying to overthrow, and defeat. If you're doing more of the crime fighter or investigator detective type campaign with your table. Finally, you could use the Hezro as a continuation of a demonic theme if you were going for a more heavily demonic campaign or series of adventures for the first X amount of adventures that you have set up for your players. So much like with the previous demonic monsters that we've discussed in previous episodes, you could create a campaign or a series of adventures that revolve around a demon lord or some sort of greater demon deciding that it's their time to take over the material plane and claim it as their own kingdom. Or you could implement it as a lesser demon seeking out the opportunity to ascend in the ranks of the hierarchy of demons and become a greater demon or demon lord itself. And in doing so, it generates and summons and commands other lesser demons to cause havoc and chaos on the material plane to maintain power and develop more power and become stronger and stronger till it can challenge a greater demon or demon lord. And if you're going that route, a demon like the Hezro would fit in many different circumstances, right? You could use the Hezro as one of many foot soldiers that the players may have to go up against. Perhaps you use the Hezro as a general or captain, if you would, for even lesser demons, for like a band of even lesser demons. You could use the Hezro as a monster in perhaps a town or city that's very old, that has maybe a shrine underneath it to a demon lord, or not too far away from it, there's a sort of ritual grounds, if you would, or a point of power. Perhaps there's a weakness or a thinness in the veil where demons can rupture it and proceed through to the material plane. And you could implement that in many different ways as well, right? Perhaps suddenly in the city, it has begun to stink very badly. There's suddenly a stench that is terrible, smells like rotted flesh or waste that's been out in the open for months or something like that, that seems to be permeating the city, coming up from perhaps the holes, like the sewer holes and the grates in the city. And so your players are charged with the task of investigating the sewers to see what's going on. You know, you could always even give them a bit of misdirection and say that the city used to have an issue when it was first formed, or in its early years, there was an issue where when they were building the sewer system or the sewage system, they had to deal with these sort of parasitic or insect-like creatures. You could even present it like spiders, giant spiders, or perhaps some form of other rodent, maybe rats or something like that. You could throw in even a gelatinous cube in there, because that was the monster that was thrown in there to sort of clean out the sewer system so that everything would stay relatively sanitary, let's call it, stuff like that. And so you can then fill in this sewer system with a bunch of other monsters that are not necessarily just demonic, or you could present these other monsters that were present as a form of misdirect for your players, so that they're expecting to go up against certain types of monsters, but when they get there or get deep enough into the sewer system, they realize that they're going up against these strange demonic creatures that do in fact perhaps appear to be insects, but are not, right? Things such as the chasme or the dredge, right? And as they go through the sewers, they're taking out these kind of bug-like monsters that aren't really exactly bugs, you know? And maybe when they get to the final point, they see this Hezro sort of seated there eating on something, or perhaps sitting on a pile of bones or of waste or what have you. And your players have to contend with it right there. Perhaps this rift that we mentioned earlier, this sort of fracture or chink in the armor of the veil, if you would, that allows abyssal creatures to pass through, is located in this sewer. And your players have to stop the Hezro from coming through, or destroy the Hezro and destroy the rift or portal or what have you that is allowing these demonic creatures to traverse into the material plane, right? You could even have it built up as an actual framed shrine or portal or something like that, that allows for people to summon demons through, or for demons to pass through. Perhaps it's one of these types of devices, let's say, that was constructed there and then it was decommissioned or deactivated, and now for some reason it has been reactivated and nobody really knows why or how. And then if you haven't yet, you can use that as a thread for your players, where you can now implement something like an occultist cabal or a criminal thieves type guild, sort of seedy underbelly that's trying to pull some strings and get something going here for their own benefit, right? But all in all, I think the Hezro is a pretty cool monster, pretty interesting demon. It's a little straightforward in terms of its lore and stats. Definitely appears to be designed as a monster of the day type creature, if you would. I don't particularly see the Hezro coming up with any grand plans or any sort of, you know, masterful strokes of genius where it's going to rule the world or all the realms. But all in all, I think it's a pretty cool monster. I think it can be used in a lot of ways. It looks kind of like a slod, which is interesting, especially if you have players that have played D&D before and are familiar with like the slotty and stuff like that. You can present something like the Hezro and describe it in such a way, and your players will immediately think, oh crap, there's a slide, they can cause some damage and blah, blah. And it in fact is not, right? Kind of keeps them on their toes. But with all that said, I think the Hezro is a pretty sweet looking monster. I think it's pretty cool in terms of its look, its abilities. It's pretty hefty. I mean, it's challenge rating 8, so it's not there for a 3rd level party to contend with, although you could set it up that way and have the Hezro leave them alone or run off or anything like that. Perhaps there's a system or a Rube Goldberg-esque type machine or contraption that they have to activate to stop the Hezro because they can't take it on head on. But either way, I think the Hezro would be a really cool monster to use in an adventure for the party at your table. But that's all I've got for you fine folks today when it comes to the Hezro. On the next episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Manes, I think it's pronounced. Maybe Manas, but I believe it's pronounced Manes, which is a pretty gnarly looking monster as well. I'm kind of getting zombie flesh golem vibes, which is pretty awesome. But either way, we'll save that for next time. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. Please feel free to rate, like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff wherever you're listening to this podcast, as it would help me greatly. I'd appreciate it quite a lot. And, it would help the podcast get to more people, get more ears listening in on it, get more viewers to the YouTube channel, all that stuff. You can find the podcast wherever you would find podcasts normally, as well as on YouTube. And maybe we can get this podcast to the ears of more up-and-comer dungeon masters, newcomer dungeon masters, or game masters, or perhaps anybody that would be interested in running a game of Dungeons and Dragons or any other tabletop RPG really, and maybe give them some food for thought, help those creativity muscles get going, and make for a fun time with their friends at the table. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you fine folks. Thank you very much once again. I'm MaxMcCool, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.